I was charged with a 50-year sentence for a crime that I committed. I was young, but I knew what I was doing, and I did it because I wanted revenge. Now, I look at my actions, and I'm lucky to be alive to tell you my story. I was born and raised in Marrero, Louisiana, where I lived with my mom and brother. My brother was only 1 year older than I was, but I looked up to him, and he was my best friend who always looked after me. In school, we were both the popular kids because we were friends with everyone. But the thing that made us different was that he was in a gang, and I wasn't. One night I woke up to the sounds of my older brother screaming in pain. I ran straight to his yells, and when I got to him, he was laying on the floor. I didn't know where it was coming from and where it ended. All I knew was he had been shot. I tried my best to put pressure on his wounds and keep him alive as best as I could, but I could feel his pulse slowly fading. I held him on my lap, telling him to hold on and that help was on their way. Then, he closed his eyes, and I felt his breathing slow until he left this life and faded into the next. He died before he even made it on the stretcher. His passing left a void in my life. I rarely ate, I barely went outside or did much of anything until a year had passed, and during my mourning, my mom had been diagnosed with cancer, and her medical bills were making it hard for us to live any kind of life. Even though she tried to be strong, I would see her pain and suffering as she struggled to pay for her medical treatments and put food on the table. She would never admit it to me, but I knew. So I did the only thing I knew I could. I dropped out of school and joined the same gang my brother had. At first, this worked and we were living fine, but as we fell behind on our bills, we were forced to live in extreme poverty, where we constantly moved from house to house and family to friends all throughout our neighborhood. Then one of my friends, a gang member, told me that he could solve all my problems. I felt like my prayers had been answered. I asked him how. He then told me there was a rival who they wanted gone, and if I did a job, they'd pay me generously for my actions. At first, I wasn't too interested in the offer because I thought about my mom and I couldn't leave her, but his last words piqued my interest. He told me that this was the guy who was responsible for my brother's. I went home that night and thought to myself the pros and cons of this atrocious act. I decided that there were far more pros than cons. My only concern was my mother, but I was reassured that no one would ever find out and that I wouldn't be alone. So I gathered with my closest friends, who I knew had my back, and we came up with a plan. Then we all gathered into a small 4-door Chevy. The entire ride we drove in silence. I could see on their faces what they were thinking, some about the plan, running it over in their minds, and the rest about the act we were about to commit. When we got to the man's house, we ran straight to the door and knocked it down. We then rushed up the stairs where I saw him standing in his bedroom. For a moment, I blacked out and stared him in the eyes, taking in the face that took my brother's life. And then, all I heard was a bang. I had pulled my trigger and he fell to the ground. We looked around for a few minutes and began taking jewelry, money, anything we could find. We got out of there before other people came, but not the cops, because cops didn't really care for that part of the city. It was only days after where I finally reflected on my actions. We were all so young, and I said to myself, this life isn't meant for everyone. This man had a family, kids, people who loved and admired him. The jewelry I grabbed and the money made from the hit really helped my mother. It all seemed worth it getting everything I wanted. My mom was provided for, and I avenged my brother's death. Until one night, a loud bang echoed through my house. Then the front door flew open with men in army gear and dogs, and big rifles aimed at me, telling me to get on the floor and show my hands. The moment I stepped in front of that camera, everything came crashing down. They told me that a friend had turned themselves in for the crime and had confessed, and named me as the person who pulled the trigger and staged it all. I was only 15 and had no knowledge of the law, and had the education of a 7th grader. I didn't know my rights or what was happening. All they told me was to confess to the crimes or I would get the death penalty. So I walked them through everything and signed my life away. The process was fast, and because of my crime, they tried me as an adult, sentencing me to 50 years. 50 years was an eternity, and all I could think about was how would I survive. The first few years, I was transferred to different facilities and tried my best to stay under the radar. I didn't join any groups, and I always looked over my shoulder just in case I accidentally upset someone. I kept worrying about what could happen while I was in jail, when really it was what I was missing outside. I learned this when I was told my mother had succumbed to her cancer while I was in there. I never got to say my goodbyes, and the worst part was knowing that she died without either of her sons by her side. I always thought school was a waste of time, but when I was in there, going to school became my saving grace. I knew the world was passing me by, but every time I read or learned something new, I felt free. So I poured everything I had into those books, eventually earning my bachelor's in accounting. And after 20 years, I was released to a new world, ready to find a job and undo my wrongs. But it didn't take long for me to learn just how difficult that would be. Every time I applied someplace, even with my accounting degree, I was shut down because by law, I had to admit that I had committed a felony and no one wanted a criminal. This left me homeless, barely eating, spending my time in and out of jail just to survive. So I was sitting outside a McDonald's one day when the manager came out and asked me if I wanted a job. I said yes, and he threw me a janitor's apron and paid me under the table. My first paycheck wasn't much, but I didn't care because for the first time, I had earned those few dollars, and that meant everything to me. It made me realize I had a chance at some life other than the one I thought I was worth. It gave me a chance to break my destructive cycle and remember who I could be. So I gathered my strength and enrolled myself in a rehab center to finally let my demons go and be who I wanted to become. I knew I wanted to give back and prevent others from experiencing the same mistakes. So I began going to schools across my city to speak about crime and teach children the mistakes that I grew from. It felt like things automatically fell into place. The more I gave, the more I was able to grow and view life through the correct lens. All my life I had believed living to be a tit-for-tat game. I always looked out for myself and naively thought revenge or instilling fear in others meant power. But it wasn't until I let go of the past and started bettering my surroundings instead of ignoring them that I understood the word power. I'm not saying I'm a good man. I've done many wrongs in my life. Some I wish I could forget and take back. But I do want to say this. Just because you were born in a rough neighborhood, you have less than others around you, or you're tempted by power, it doesn't define your worth, and it doesn't have to be who you become. This was the hand that life dealt me, and when I look back, I remember what mattered to me most. Life may deal you a bad hand, but it's up to you how you want to play it. I know I'm satisfied with what I have. Thank you for watching. TMB.